Welcome to the GRN Network, the Growth and Resilience Network, and the latest episode on our podcast channel. Hi, I'm Steve Piscitelli, your host, and coming to you today, not from my world headquarters in Atlantic Beach, Florida, but rather from our mobile studio in Etowah, North Carolina, from the home of our guest. And buckle up, folks. This is going to be a powerful one. And I thank you for joining us. Adoption. What comes to mind when you hear that word? Adoption. What synonyms would you have you used for that word? What emotions does it conjure? Now, I've noticed a common theme or set of themes when I've done just a little bit of digging into the topic. You'll hear about grief, separation, loss, self-esteem, identity, attachment issues, identity for the adopted parents, how to create a family story, anger, emotional issues, challenge with social relationships. And when you think about those and others that our guests will introduce us to and enlighten us about today, you have to then look at resilience. How does the adoptee, how does the adopted family, and how does the birth family, how does that triad deal with all of that? So as I said, we've traveled to North Carolina today to speak with a man, an adoptee when he was about 2 years old, and he'll give you more details, in his birthplace of Kingston upon Hull, England. I'm going to let John Longbottom fill us in on the details of his life as our conversation evolves, because he knows adoption and I do not. He knows it firsthand. This is his story, and I'm fortunate that he has chosen to share it with us today. Now, I came to know John when he showed up at a songwriters night in Atlantic Beach, Florida. I don't know, I think we were saying last night over dinner something like 2005 or so. I was immediately taken by this man's lyrics. He's a masterful storyteller. He's a great musician. And we became friends, and eventually he even came into some of my campus classes, performed for students, and then helped facilitate conversations on music, lyrics, and message. And I'm going to post some of those links of our sessions with my former students. They're fun, and they're quite enlightening. And that's one of the benefits we have with John and having him here today. Not only has he still lives with adoption, he knows how to facilitate conversations, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to let John start us off today. I thank him for being with us. He's going to help us wrap our heads around adoption and the concomitant issues. So, John, I'm going to throw it to you and let you start us off.
I was born in the rain. Hell, I was probably conceived in the rain. A cold, hard, wind-driven off the North Sea rain that seeps into the very marrow of the bones with an ache that never quite dissolves. A bitter rain that leaches into some dark, distant corner of the soul, and no amount of spiritual healing can completely erase. I was born after the fists of winter had squeezed almost every drop of life from the livestock, trees, and heather. I was born when people pinched and war-weary shrank a little further into themselves and wondered if the sun would ever rekindle its reviving warmth. I did not choose to be born. I was thrust out of the room in which I had lain, kicked and grown, into a damp and dreary world of ruins, depression and hunger. A world that was on the brink of beginning its own rebirth, struggling to find the strength in a country exhausted and depleted by the consuming bedlam of war. I did not choose to be adopted.
And with that, we shall start. Powerful. Do you want to, I'm going to throw this to you, John. Do you want to start with talking about that you wrote? Those are your words, correct?
That's my words.
Those are your words.
Yeah.
or do you want to start with saying a little bit about who you are and set the context that leads us back to those words? How about that?
Well, thank you for letting me be here, Steve. Let me just give you a quick history. Can I give you my story?
Yes, that's what we need, your story.
Really quickly. Obviously, I was born and I'm a baby boomer. I'm a true baby boomer. I was born in 1947, following the Second World War.
And that's one of the references in there, the ruin and the depression is the war.
And by all accounts, I've gone back and looked, and it was a very, very harsh winter. People were struggling. Coal was in short supply. There was no heating, and people had a very, very hard time of it. And I was born right after that harsh, harsh winter. Mm. So my birth mother went through a very hard time as a pregnant lady. But I was born, and 2.5, at the age of 2, I was put up for adoption. I don't quite know what age I was when I was put up for adoption, but an adoption process started when I was 2 years old. I don't know why or how, but I was adopted by a couple, and I was almost immediately whisked away by my adopted mother to Singapore. Singapore, in what we call the Far East in those days.
So this is going to be around 48, 49?
49.
49, okay.
I think we sailed by boat, 3-week voyage.
Wow. Yeah. Around the tip of Africa.
Around the tip of Africa. I remember nothing of it, but no, I was suddenly taken from this war-weary, wet, cold fishing port on the east coast of England, and I was on this boat for 3 weeks and then arrived in tropical Singapore. 2.5 years old, and with a strange mother, and meeting for the first time my strange new father. I often wonder today what I must have felt. I can't remember. I really don't know, but it must have been really, really strange. So I was raised. My father was in the British Army. That's why we were in Singapore, and he was in the jungles fighting against resurgence. And it was a time of the English Vietnam. But there, Vietnam happened in what was then called Malaya, now called Malaysia. Mm-hmm. And so I was there, and we came back to England after that tour, and stayed around England, and then my parents, and I'm going to call them my parents. When I say parents, it's my adopted parents.
Adopted parents.
And I have no idea of my birth father or my birth mother, but I will call them that, birth father, birth mother.
Okay.
Just to save confusion. It's very confusing when you have so many parents, And I've got so many names. I was figuring out last night, I have 6 names.
6?
Yeah.
Okay. You got John.
I've got John.
Yes.
Right.
You got Longbottom.
I've got Longbottom, and that's and my middle name, Anthony.
Anthony. That comes from the adopted family.
That comes from the adopted family.
Okay.
When I finally found out my birth certificate, I had a different name, obviously, and that was Clive. Okay. Anthony. They kept me Anthony for some reason.
Oh, okay.
But then I had Smith Brown, hyphenated. And
you might be talking about this later. I know you've attempted a search, but we're not able to uncover everything or much. Mm-hmm. So those questions that I see on your face right now, they still exist.
Correct.
About the names, and who's Smith, who's the hyphenated name, who's Clive, where they came from, where they went.
I have no idea.
No idea.
Yeah. No idea.
And that... Okay, we're going back to your story, which you were saying, but eventually you'll tell us that no idea. How has that shaped John? Did it shape John? Is that a reason we're here today, talking about this?
It is. I mean, to this day, having gone through, which we'll learn today, what I went through, it is still a big question mark.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a question mark I've learned to deal with and accept. It's one of the mysteries of life, of my personal life, you know. And what do we do with mysteries? We fight them or we accept them. And acceptance is the key, I found.
Mm.
But so being adopted like that, I suspect children are very resilient and they can adapt themselves to many different environments much more quickly than we adults can. So I imagine I just accepted my situation and go, you know, oh, this is different. This is kind of cool. And I know that my adopted parents loved me, and I was told I was loved. And I was given a lot of that was probably not what my birth mother could have given me. My father was an officer in the British Army, so he was pretty well off.
And that's the adopted father.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So we were in England again. Then my parents, 5 years after I was adopted another child, a girl, a baby, and she was a swaddling baby, and very, 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 very young, and adopted my sister. And as far as I know, we are not related. And if you look at us, we don't look alike at all. She's blonde and very Scandinavian looking, and I'm me. Yeah,
We'll post the photo.
yes. We'll leave the question mark.
Swarthy.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and then again, we were whisked back to Malaysia. And I think that was to... there was a stigma attached to adoption in those days. There was a shame attached to it. And I think the whisking away was like a woman going away and having an abortion. It was done in secret.
Was it the stigma for the adopted parents?
I believe so, yeah.
Did your adopted parents ever talk to you about that?
No.
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 They did talk about adoption, though.
I was informed that I was adopted. I think I was informed earlier when I couldn't remember. The next time I think I was told was I was about 8 or 9 years old. And we'd settled back in England after our tours abroad. And this was going to be settling here for good. My father was going to retire from the army. And I was told that I was adopted and that I was loved very much and I was chosen and all the usual words that are given to adoptees.
And you accept it, reject it? How did you handle that as an 8-year-old? Do you recall?
To me, it said, the way it was placed to me, I was loved. I was loved more than a regular child. So the next day, I went to school running, I'm loved, I was adopted, blah, blah, blah. And I was really happy about this and showing off. And somebody at the school must have called my parents and told them what was going on, because when I got home, I walked into a thunderstorm. This was not allowed. This was not done. You do not share family secrets, and you especially do not tell them you're adopted. And suddenly the joy of adoption was taken away, and I was punished for spreading secrets.
Wow.
So suddenly adoption was not joy anymore. It was a secret, and it was something to be hidden from the world.
If I may, and we'll keep on with this, but do you think that's the same? Do you know if that's the same today? This is a family secret. I don't know if you have stayed within the adoption circles, if you've talked to other adopted parents.
I obviously I can't speak for other people. I can only speak for my own experiences. But I have read there are groups out there of adoptees, and I've read some of their posts on social media. And yes, it still goes on today. The lying.
You were sharing some of those last night with me, I think.
Yeah.
Do you care to share any of those?
Well,
And if you want, you could do it at some other point in the podcast.
Yeah. No, I think it's appropriate now that there's a group that's on social media, and they are called, this is their term, not mine, Bastard Nation. Now, this refers obviously to people who are illegitimate. I don't think I was illegitimate in the sense on my birth certificate it shows my mother's name and my birth father's name.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Smith and the Brown right there. But they talk about we get to go on this nifty epic search for our roots. We're good at lying and being lied to. So today it still goes on, the deceit. If we find our birth family, we have the chance of having two great families. If we find our birth family, we have the chance of having two crappy families. If we find our birth family, we have the chance of having one great family and one crappy family.
Emotions.
Yeah.
Emotions. So, you're back in England. You're 8 or so. You have found out, as you remember now for the first time, you're adopted. You're excited. Mm-hmm. I'm special. I'm chosen. I'm loved. You spread the word.
Yeah.
You're punished.
Right.
And it changes your view on adoption as a young child.
Right.
Do you have recollection at that point of any change in your behavior other than not talking about adoption? Was there a change in how John viewed the world?
I don't remember. I think at the time it was pointed out to me that I could not find who my birth parents were, and they had no knowledge. So that was a useless road to go down, and don't go down that road because that would hurt.
That would hurt.
Yes.
And they closed that, they attempted to. Well, they did, I guess, for a number of decades.
Right. Yeah.
They closed that. Did it change how you viewed John?
I'm not conscious of it, but I know looking back, my actions would say yes, it did. How I started to grow up. Let me say that everything's in hindsight.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because I got on with living, basically. I would still occasionally, I remember, you have the fantasies of where I really came from, and the prince and the pauper fantasies. It's always the prince, And, And I want to get out of this family sometimes. My parents were rather strict. My dad was a military man, and my mother was a military wife. And they were both very strict. But they also said they loved me all the time. Mm-hmm. So I had adjustments to make. Later in life, much later in life, when I was a grown adult, supposedly in age at least, I was suggested by therapists that I had been, suggested by a couple of therapists, that I had been abused when I was very, very young.
Pre-adoption?
Pre-adoption.
Pre-adoption.
They suspect. Which made me, and the therapist said, I came into the world I did not trust the world. The world was not a safe place for me. So I came into this new family not trusting anyone. So
even though you didn't maybe consciously know that at 2 years old, 4 years old, 8 years old, but these therapists are saying this. Do you know why they thought you were abused? I mean, was there evidence?
I think in my history, my life history, the way I've reacted, the way I have rebelled, against authority, against my adopted parents. My substance abuse, everything leads to tick off this, tick off that abuse. My distrust of people, I still have a distrust of people today. That was and I think that for a therapist, those were all the points that were raised.
Okay, I see.
And then, so I wouldn't trust anyone. And then I'm told that my joy of being adopted and being loved and being special, and that was taken away from me. So the distrust is validated, if you will. So, and I think that way I became a bit more of a loner. But also, at the same time as a loner, I became a people pleaser.
Interesting.
To try and please people, to fit in, to be liked.
Now, you were a rugby star. You were a swimming champion in high school.
Yeah.
Yeah. So athletic, and you went to music.
Yeah.
When you were in your teens, had your first band. Name?
The Outcasts.
Is it Outcats? C-A-T-S?
No,
or
Casts.
Cast? The Outcasts.
Outcasts.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting name.
Yeah. I don't know where that came from, but we felt it was good.
You mentioned the people pleasing. Was that part of why you got into music? You're on stage, people are smiling, applauding, dancing, or was there something else that drove you to the stage, drove you to music?
I don't really know. What drove me to the stage was it wasn't initially I was in the school plays, and I always wanted to be in the school plays. Every year in high school they put on a big Shakespearean production, and I always wanted to be in there. I never got except a walk-on part, and I don't think I ever spoke a line, but I was there.
You were there,
yeah. And so I loved the stage.
Did the stage provide a sense of acceptance?
I think so, and identity.
Identity. Talk a little bit about it, because that's one of the issues. You shared with me, and I've done, like I said, I did a little bit of reading, and let me just interject these here.
Sure, please.
And then I'd like to come back to that identity, because you shared that there are a number of core issues that the research indicates, that the therapist will talk about, that you've experienced. And I'm going to list these: loss, rejection, guilt, shame, grief, identity, intimacy, mastery, control. And I had a question noted here for myself to ask you, which is there one that rises to the top with you? You just mentioned identity. Did that rise to the top?
I think that's one of the main core issues that I've had, is one of identity. And I can give you some... There's a quote from the research that I did not so long ago, actually, 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay.
And this is, identity is defined both by what one is and what one is not. Obviously, I was not of this biological family. So what was I? And I had no idea. And when you grow up, adolescents are searching for their own identity. That is prerequisite of an adolescent. I didn't know. I had this, what they call genetic bewilderment. I did not know who I was. I knew that I was different. I did not come of this family, this adopted family. Genetically, I was different. We had differences. I didn't look too different from my father, so I fit in physically. People wouldn't go, oh, obviously not one of ours. I could look close enough to and the funny thing is, this brings a question. When I finally had a child of my own, my son And if you look at photographs of him as a young man and look at photographs of my father as a young man, they could be the same person. Which, was one of the questions I had. Maybe my father had an illicit affair, my adopted father, and I was the product and was adopted by his family.
So this is a story that John is creating as a part to find the identity.
Yeah. Yeah, and it happened once. I went on around 14 years old. I went to France on exchange programs, lived with a French family for a month, and I fell in love with the French. Why? Because they were how I wanted to be. They expressed their emotions. The English at the time were very much like the traditional Japanese. You do not display your emotions. You were very stiff upper lip. It's just not done to express this loving in public. You might do it in private, but you do not express the outward emotions. And I thought, oh, this is great. These people, I'm really French,
And and this is 14 years old.
Yeah.
And I'm taken by a couple things as you're saying this. One, with your adopted family, it appears, just from listening, that you had material comforts. I mean, you're able to travel. You went to, was it a private school?
No,
it wasn't a private. It was an all-boys school that you went to. But a classical education. It sounded like it was a sound education. You obviously, I think you had said you and your father, you bought your first cheap guitar, and then you and your father chipped in and you got the better guitar, and you went halvesies. There sounds like there was you weren't a meal away from starvation, and at the same time you were not able to talk about who John was, where John came from. So while you had a great roof, a nice bed, a good school, there was something desperately missing.
Yeah,
and you're not able to talk about that at that time.
Not even talk about it, but rarely identify it. There's a dis-ease, if you will. But what is it? Where is it coming from? My parents would wonder where the anger is coming from, and I think they would probably just write it down as adolescent angst. Look back in anger.
It's just the rebellion of the youth. So it. All right, continue.
Well, I just want to continue with the identity thing, because it's been a theme throughout my life. When you look at my musical career, and of course I got the identity from playing in a band, for being with my peers, if you will, and also a little rebellion, because rock and roll was still at that stage of, it was looked down upon.
So now we're talking early 60s?
Yeah.
Early 60s,
yeah.
Okay.
Early 60s.
Okay.
At the time of the Beatles were beginning, I remember distinctly riots and people trashing movie theaters when Bill Haley and the Comets movie was Rock Around the Clock and Bill Haley movie. And I remember as a youth going to a concert or a dance where my favorite band was playing. And they were all in jeans and leather jackets and all this cool stuff. And my parents dressed me in yellow, bright canary yellow sweater, because my mother was never stopped knitting. And I was so mortified. I was trying to show off with the leader of the band. I brought a switchblade back from France. Illegally, and I was showing him my switchblade, and he called me the Canary Kid.
Oh, God.
And I was trying to be cool as hell, find my own identity.
Yeah.
But then later, I got into Irish music in the 80s in America, and I identified with the Irish. I was trying to find an identity that was not me.
Mm.
So I almost pretended to be Irish all the time, and I got my identity there. And that goes with another thing of rejection. If you feel that I was rejected by my birth parents, and there's a certain psychological thing where you go out and you put yourself in situations where you will be rejected.
Explain that. Why would you do that?
I don't know. This is a psychological thing I came across.
Is it you think it's you put yourself in a position to get rejected, you get rejected and say, see, I'm right, I don't fit in any, I mean, is it that road?
I think it is, yeah. It's the shame road. The road of shame. And all these things intertwine. I also had this obviously this fear of abandonment, and I'd put that down through my life to the fact that we traveled so much as a child, but it was because I was abandoned by my birth mother, and that I've been married. I'm on my 5th marriage. What the fear of abandonment did for me was that I'm going to be abandoned in any case, so I'm going to end this relationship before you hurt me. I'll do the hurting. Thank you very much. And I did that consistently throughout my life until I learnt about it. Therapy.
Therapy. I was just going to ask. So you found a therapist or therapists, numerous, who helped you see this?
Opened my eyes, yes. They said I had to connect my heart and my head. They said they were disconnected.
Mm.
And this came about because of substance abuse. I was a practicing alcoholic and drug user, searching for an identity, because alcohol gave me a completely different persona. And the more I drank and the more that disease progressed, the more the persona progressed, from the part people pleaser to, I once described myself as a mixture of Brenda Lee and Johnny Rotten.
Oh, God.
And Brenda Lee going, I'm sorry, so sorry, and Johnny Rotten goes, you know, I'm not bloody sorry, you know.
Oh, and the alcohol. So you're playing music. Is it connected with the music? Is it?
Yeah, my whole identity became around the music. I was,
And the alcohol was, I don't know, it was a piece of that. It was a prop with that, but it was more than I guess it was a prop in a way.
Yeah.
And you, from what I recall from other conversations we've had, you were hitting the bottle hard.
Oh, I got up to a bottle of whiskey a day, and it was free. And a lot of the time, the cocaine was free. People give it to you. There was one club manager who would pay me in cocaine.
God.
Well, we don't have enough money in the till, but here's a gram or two,
Now you've been clean, sober.
Clean and sober.
For 30 years?
30 years, yeah.
30 years. There was something that caught your attention.
Well, let's say I've been sober for 30 years. It took me 13 years to get 1 year of sobriety.
Explain that for us.
I was first introduced to AA in the 70s, and by my wife at the time thought I was an alcoholic, and we went to what I thought was a marriage counselor. He was really a substance abuse counselor, who suggested that I was an alcoholic and I should go to AA. And I went to AA and I suggested that I wasn't an alcoholic, or if I was an alcoholic, I did not give a damn, and I'm not going to AA. And so, it wasn't a constant battle. I'd go out and drink for 4 years, and then I'd get sick and tired of being sick and tired, so I'd sober up again for 6 or 9 months and start feeling good, and then go out and do it again.
And so that's the 13-year on and off, on and off, on and off. And then at some point you just said, off. I need to stop this.
Yeah.
And you have for 30 years.
Yeah.
The connecting of the heart and the head, I can't get away from that. That's intriguing.
Well, that was. I grew up. My dad was very competitive, and I was brought up to be competitive. But my nature is not competitive. I'm not a very competitive person. It doesn't come in with a people pleaser is not a competitive person, and I was also brought up to be macho. You don't cry, you don't hurt. Get up, stand up, get back up. Do it again. Both my adoptive parents were like that. My father and my mother. There was no sympathy if I fell over and grazed myself. It was get up, get back, do it. So I had this macho image, and I tried to have that macho image in my personal life, in my marriages, in my relationships. I was a Gestapo, and so when I finally sobered up and I finally got into looking at my character defects, if you will, I needed help. I could not do it through the program of Alcoholics Anonymous alone. I had to have therapy. And that's when the therapist said, you've got this one side of you that's this macho, feels you've got to be a hard ass. So, excuse me. And on the other side is you're not like that. You're a gentle, caring human being. And we need to reconcile that, the hard ass is in the head and the gentle one is in the heart.
And that helped John.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
I mean, you could say, some people would say that was the masculine side and the feminine side, or the yin and the yang, if you will.
And you've been in a loving, close relationship now for 20-something years?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Obviously, lots is working. Not just something, a bunch of things have worked.
Yeah. It was a lot of hard work, and my wife, Mary, as well, has been very supportive. And she has done a lot of hard work as well for herself. Mm-hmm. She was in a difficult marriage before mine. And she went through her own therapies and her own change.
Right. There's each has his or her own path, but there is some commonality to some that we can and this, if we bring it back to adoption today, as we sit here toward the end of 2019, does John Longbottom have reconciliation? Does one ever reconcile? Is that not even a good word for it? Is adoption still out there in your mind, in there in your heart? I've got to find, because I know you did attempt to find your birth parents and you were unsuccessful.
Right.
You were not able to. So is that still a force?
I don't think it's a force so much. It's there. There's still the question. Like you said, I tried to find out who my birth parents were. I was going through Ancestry.com. That's what led me to this search. Both my adoptive parents are dead, so it wouldn't hurt them. It wouldn't, I was clear on that front.
Right.
The trouble is, my birth parents had the most common names in the English language of Smith and Brown. When I saw those names, I was devastated. You're looking, I was so excited to get my birth parents' names, and then, I could look them up on her ancestry. But Smith and Brown, come on. There's a million people. So I was very, very disappointed, and I tried, and through agencies and everything, and records have been lost and destroyed, floods and fires, and no digital records were made in those days, obviously.
Right.
And so eventually, it comes down to acceptance. Okay.
Acceptance of John.
Acceptance of me, acceptance of the fact that I will not find my birth parents, that I am going to be genetically bewildered for the rest of my life, if you will. And let's get on with it.
Is there an argument to be made if all of these, if there are these core issues, the anger, the identity, the rejection, emotional trauma, this challenge with social relationships, is there an argument to be made not to tell the child you're adopted?
Personally, I don't think so, because the I don't fit in syndrome, which I've had all my life, and it started with the adopted family, and then it went into any social situation I was in. I don't fit in. I've had a hard time with bands, for instance. My best time has been as a solo performer. That feeling of genetic bewilderment, the identity, I do not fit in, is there. You cannot take that away. And it would just become a big, a growing question mark. I did want to say that one aspect of adoption, and this is kind of parallel idea, was when I got married very young. I was 20 when I got married, and it was a
Number one.
It was a shotgun wedding, the product of a very drunken night, and so we decided to get married. We made the wrong choice and keep the child, and the child was born, and I deserted him and his mother when he was 18 months old. I went off to be a star, just disappeared in London. My rationale, and I remember thinking this quite clearly, was, well, I was adopted, so he's going to be fine. Somebody will come along, she'll marry, she'll find somebody else, he'll adopt my son, and he'll grow up thinking that's his father, and that'll be fine because it worked for me. That was that's what the adoption did.
And did you ever reconnect?
Once I finally sobered up, funnily enough, fate, if you call it that, my parents, my adoptive parents, from whom I was basically estranged by this time, sent me a letter saying that my son was trying to find me and had contacted my father through the army, the War Office records in England.
Wow.
And my father sent me the letter saying, we got this from your son, but we would suggest you ignore it.
Ignore it?
Yes. Do not respond. We have not responded to the letter, don't you? Oh, they did respond. They wrote back and said, as far as we know, John is living in the United States. We don't have any contact with him.
And how old were you at this time?
I was 42, 43 years old.
And the son would have been?
He was in his
20s?
20s, yeah.
20s, okay.
But I wrote back, obviously, and said, yes, I'm your father, and I'm not proud of what I've done, and can we meet? And he came over.
He came to the United States?
Mm-hmm.
Did he? Wow. How was that?
It was very, very tricky. I remember saying to I don't know what number wife it was at the time, but I was 1 year sober. I had no idea who the hell I was.
And this is the 1 year sober on your 30 years?
Yes.
Okay, so when it became,
this
you were down this road.
The real thing, yeah.
The real thing, right, okay.
I was still in a fog from sobering up. And I learned that the person I was drinking would no longer work for me. I had to change if I wanted to stay sober.
Another identity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I had to find my identity damn quickly. And it couldn't be the charades that I've been playing.
And now your son arrives in the United States. You meet for the first time, well, since he was about
18 months.
18 months.
Yeah. He was very, very gracious. And his mother had been very, very gracious. She never bad-mouthed me. All she had said was that we were too young, which I thought was very, very generous of her, considering I just did a bunk, never sent alimony, never sent child payments or anything. Anyway, I never had any damn money, so not that that's an excuse. So he was very gracious, and we got to know each other. And we found, even though we proved what's the difference between nurture and nature, that we were very similar. Our mannerisms were almost identical, even though he had not grown up with me in his life. Our sense of humor was exactly the same. Weird.
Yeah. How'd that make you feel?
Strange. It's very strange.
Did it do anything with the identity?
Somewhat. It did, yeah. I had still had a hard time getting my idea of being a father. That was too much responsibility for me at the time. And I think I was consumed with the guilt. There we get back to that guilt.
Mm-hmm. And he's feeling gracious. And he was able to do something that you were not able to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not that he was never, was he adopted eventually, or?
He was, well, he had a bad, I think his mother remarried finally, and they had a bad experience with that.
So a little different than your circumstance, but there are a number of similarities as well.
Yeah.
But he is able to find and connect with. He knew who his birth father was, but he wanted to connect with, and did.
Yeah.
Something you were not able to do. Did that seem to help him?
It did. People a couple of years later, he got married, and I went over for the wedding. And his friends, I met all his friends, and they said ever since he was a young kid, he'd wanted to know who his father was.
That had to be, well, how'd that make you feel?
Tearful.
In what way?
It's like, well, I put him through all that,
The guilt again?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he seemed, again, as another podcast guest had said to me, you never move on, but you move forward.
Yeah.
And it sounds like he had moved forward.
He'd moved on. And, but, I noticed he drank an awful lot. I saw certain traits that of the defect side of me. Mm. I didn't say anything, but I noticed that.
Yeah.
Eventually, I think his drinking was... He died young, in his 30s from a motorcycle accident.
Oh.
And I think drinking, he wasn't drunk at the time, but his choices were affected by his drinking.
Mm. Wow. And you said something I think is powerful. This is your story. You can't speak for other people. So with that, you can't tell, well, you should do this, you should do that. I mean, people have to find their own road. So with that as a background here, if you were a therapist and you're working with, a little bit I'm learning is that therapists see people and maybe a number of their caseload are people who were adopted. Is there something that you would say or is there questions you would ask to help the adoptee find some peace?
That'll be $125, please. Your time's up. That's what a therapist would say. I think I would go straight for the I'd go straight for the identity for one thing. But but the other thing that I would like to, one thing that blew my mind when I finally I learned about adoption because of my search for my birth parents. I did a lot of research. And the thing that blew my mind was that there is a triad with adoptees. There's the adoptee themselves, there's the birth mother, father, parents, and then there's the adopted parents. And the research, as far as I see, says that all three of the triad suffer from those core issues. And I think that's something, as a therapist, it blew my mind when I learnt that, and it changed my thinking on the adoption. And I think I would bring that up with if an adoptee came to see me as a therapist.
Those issues.
Yeah, because it made me think, prior to that, it was all me, the adoptee. But then it was, I never thought about my adoptive parents having issues, and the same grief, loss, anger, rejection, shame.
Compassion for them.
Compassion for them. Compassion for the birth mother. Where it might be anger, why did you get rid of me? But what were the reasons? What was the situation that made you have to? And I'd obviously been with her for a while. She didn't want the baby from the beginning. I was 2 years old.
Right. Something happened. What happened?
It was intimated by my adoptive parents that she couldn't handle it. She was having problems, whether it was financial or emotional, I don't know.
Yeah. No. But it's instructive. All right, I'm going to do 3 points here. Okay? As we move toward the end.
Oh, triads.
Yeah, there you go. Very good. There's the sense of humor.
Yeah.
As I said earlier in the introduction, I got to know you through your music. When you walked into our community center in Atlantic Beach and you got up on the stage, and I was immediately like, wow, this is amazing. And that sense of humor came in. So this is kind of a musical question from that I keep on coming back to, and you're probably shaking your head. Why does he keep talking about this? When you came to the United States, there was a woman you had met who connected you with a university. I think it was American University. Was your first gig. There were 3 things I just want you to mention or just touch on. How these 3 had related to your music career. Howdy Doody. Playing on the steps of the United States Capitol and the Black Panthers.
Oh, okay. Well, I was brought by the student union, student organization. The girlfriend I met in England at American University brought me over paid me to do a concert, I was cultural exchange.
Okay, cultural exchange.
Yeah, I was cultured. I was very cultured at the time. I remember walking through customs, here I am with long hair, I kind of, and a goatee, Van Dyke, what they called a Van Dyke, and I looked a bit like Charlie Manson.
Oh.
and the guy says, have you got any tea, meaning pot,
Oh.
And I said, yes, I've got a big 5-pound bag. I brought some English breakfast tea with me. And he looked at me like I was an absolute idiot. Anyway, so they brought me to this American university, and I'd just played small folk clubs in England, and just tiny.
And had she mentioned Howdy Doody?
No.
No.
And then suddenly I'm there, and they're, you're opening for the Howdy Doody show. And I go, what the hell is a Howdy Doody show? Who's Buffalo Bob, you know? I've heard of Wild Bill Buffalo, you know, Buffalo Bill and all that. But what the hell is... I had no idea. Anyway, it turned out he cancelled. And whether he saw me and said, that's the opening act, and says, I'm not being one to be associated with him or what, but he cancelled. So I was sent to open for a rock and roll concert, an outdoor one. Mm. And here I am, you know, I'm dressed in London hippie garb, you know, velvet bell-bottom pants.
And the year would be 70, was it?
Just 1970,
1970.
Yeah. And looking very London hippie. And I get on stage and I look out and there's about half a dozen, maybe 10 Black Panthers sitting in the front row of this concert.
And they're there as guests. They're
part of the audience.
Part of the audience, right.
But they're all on the front row, all with their arms folded, all with their black berets, all with their black leather jackets, all not smiling and all looking at me on stage going, and I'm going, oh, what did I get myself into this time?
So there's a bit of a culture introduction.
Yes, yeah.
And did you have any problems?
Well, I was singing a song I wrote, and I don't even remember the song that I'd written about the space race, which was all big at the time. Mm-hmm. And how, yes, they were spending millions of dollars on the space race, but kids were living in the ghettos and starving and blah, blah, blah. But I didn't call
them... social commentary.
Yeah, right. But I didn't call them kids. I called them black boys. Or colored boys, I think, would be the English term.
Right.
And I saw the ripple happen along the ranks of the Black Panthers. And I had no idea in those days, you know, I had no idea that was a racist comment to make.
There was an introduction through your music and that setting.
Yeah.
That's powerful. So you learned.
I learned very quickly.
Yeah.
It was brought, I think my girlfriend probably said, John, we don't say boys over here, referring to, you know,
wow,
black people.
And then the Capitol steps. There's a photo. I used to show it to my students when you came in, and there had to be it's right behind us.
Yep.
Had to be 250,000 people. It looked like at that. What was the event?
It was a solidarity day to do with that Polish leader, Walesa. And it was to do with him. It was a union thing. Pete Seeger was there. We met Pete Seeger. Who was the other guy that was there? The blind singer.
Stevie Wonder?
Stevie Wonder was there in the front row, yeah.
Wow.
And I was associated with a band called the Celtic Folk, a local DC band. And they were an Irish band, and because they were Irish, they had a lot of union connections. And we were asked to play. We were asked to be one of the groups to play for 250,000 people all stretched out along the Mall of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
I wasn't a regular member of the band. I was brought in for special occasions just to add another guitar.
Wow. And how'd that had to be a hoot.
It was a hoot and a toot because I was so hungover. The bass player and I had spent the whole night trying to chase a worm out of a bottle of tequila and also do some what we call Peruvian marching powder. And I was so hungover, and I remember standing in a porta-john doing cocaine.
Before you went on?
Before I went on. And I can barely remember the whole episode. Afterwards, I was so bad that the band never hired me again.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
I thought I was great.
And that didn't catch your attention?
It was another... It was added to the...
to the list.
To the list.
Yeah. Wow.
But it was another 9 years before I sobered up, 9 or 8 years.
All right. Is there one thing that either you haven't had a chance to address, or one thing I cut you off on as you were attempting to address it, or something you just want to reiterate before we close it? And we're going to close this a little differently than I normally do, and I'll explain that in a minute.
Okay. The only thing I'd like to say is that there's no blame. I don't feel like a victim. I don't feel that, you know, the adoptee has no choice. Perhaps the birth mother has no choice. Perhaps the adoptive parents have no choice. There's no blame. I don't blame anyone. People made the decisions and did what they had to do at the time. And I believe that, right or wrong, there was love involved.
And it's taken you a few years to get to that.
A lot of
years.
A lot of years, a lot of hard work.
Yeah, hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But an acceptance. That's the key.
John, I appreciate you sharing the story. It is it's powerful. I mean, I'm hearing myself say it's powerful, and I'm hearing myself say to myself, "What a cliche." I don't know how else to describe it. Everybody goes through issues, but you sharing your issue and the power, and then it's just all those issues just kept on permeating every aspect of your life and other lives.
Yeah.
Other lives, not just your life.
That's the ripples.
Yes, it is the ripple, and it keeps on. And it's how there was a choice here, and that I think the choice was how you've come to choose to handle this, to accept it, not accept it, be gracious, be compassionate. The words you were using last night over dinner: compassion, empathy. Still questions, acceptance. Now, for those who follow the, so thanks, John.
Well, thank you
deeply. I mean, you're a dear friend, and just to be able to hear it and watch your face and hear that smile again and that laugh. Generally, I finish with a little canned paragraph at the end of these podcasts, and I'm not going to do that today. Right now, I will thank everybody for listening. Go to my website. You can find links to other podcasts. Look at the links that I post with this one. Like I said, I'll post one of John singing in my classroom, and he allowed me to sit in. He didn't cringe too much as I was singing with him and playing guitar. But one of his great songs, Legends, powerful song. But I'm going to ask John if he would go back to that opening. And maybe that opening caught your attention and it was like, wow. And now, like a class lesson that some teachers do, they open up with a question, they open up with a reading, then you discuss things. And then you go back to the reading and see if the reading has a different impact. I'm going to let John read again, and then we will just fade into silence here. So thank you, and John, it's yours.
I was born in the rain. Hell, I was probably conceived in the rain. A cold, hard, wind-driven off the North Sea rain that seeps into the very marrow of the bones with an ache that never quite dissolves. A bitter rain that leaches into some dark, distant corner of the soul, and no amount of spiritual healing can completely erase. I was born after the fists of winter had squeezed almost every drop of life from the livestock, trees, and heather. I was born when the people, pinched and war-weary, shrank a little further into themselves, and wondered if the sun would ever rekindle its reviving warmth. I did not choose to be born. I was thrust out of the womb in which I had lain, kicked and grown, into a damp and dreary world of ruins, depression and hunger. A world that was on the brink of beginning its own rebirth, struggling to find the strength in a country exhausted and depleted by the consuming bedlam of war. I did not choose to be adopted.